In this video, I'm sharing 3 things I learned from the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. This book is probably my favorite book on the topic of habits or behavior change or willpower or however you want to slice that topic. And I was actually hesitant to read this book just because I've gone through so many of those other ones and they haven't really stuck. They haven't resonated quite as well. But this one, for me, really was the best of that on that subject. And what Atomic Habits is about is the idea that the smallest action you can do daily compounds in its results if you make it easy to do and do it consistently. Now, that's a fairly simple concept to understand. And we look back and it's easy to look back and say like, okay, well, if I had spent 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes every day for the last 3 years or the last 5 years trying to learn this second language or exercising or whatever habit that we want to work on, if I had just put in 10 minutes a day for the last 3 years, I know exactly how far ahead I would have gotten by now. But it's a lot more difficult to look ahead because we're starting at zero and we say, well, it's going to take so long to see results. But in order for change to be sustainable, in order for it to have that impact, we have to start small and then let those results compound. And that's where you really start to see a lot of gains. And the idea of habits or tiny habits even is not a new one. But this book gets into the psychology and the systems needed for those habits. And what the author highlights are really 2 crucial components to any type of behavior change. 1, dealing with your internal emotions, and then 2, the influence of external stimuli. And if you're able to keep both of those in the back of your mind, then this book helps you to tackle both of those to create sustainable habits. The first lesson I learned from this book is the idea of action and not motion. And the 2 are very different things. Motion is a sophisticated form of procrastination. It's planning, it's preparing, it's optimizing, it's figuring out the best way of doing something, but action is much more important. If you want to think of it this way, take an analogy of cooking. Motion is watching a cooking show on Netflix or YouTube and learning how it's done and the techniques and what ingredients are used and all of those things, but action is actually attempting to make the dish. And when we look forward and we say, well, if I'm going to dedicate time to learning something or changing something, we want to optimize it so we don't waste effort. But again, when we look back, we know that even an unoptimized effort would have been useful. So let's say that my habit changes. I want to walk 10,000 steps every day. Well, that might be difficult, but if I set an atomic habit where the smallest version, let's say it's 500 steps or 1,000 steps, something that's easily attainable, that's helpful. And looking back, if I had done 1,000 steps a day, that was still better maybe than, now being in a pandemic, sitting at home, getting no steps in essentially, right? And so maybe having done 1,000 or 2,000 steps a day for the past 2 years may have improved my health. And so looking forward, we have to do the same thing, is just be in action, be in a mode of action. Even if it's not optimized, even if it's inefficient, just the habit of actually doing something is going to be helpful. And one example that comes to mind is if you've ever seen like a balance scale, right? And in some countries, they would sell rice like this, where they put a weight, like a kilogram or 2 kilogram weight on one side of the balance scale. And then on the other side, they're pouring in grains of rice. Now, for a long time, the scale doesn't move. But eventually, there reaches a point where 1 grain of rice tips the scale. And then every subsequent grain of rice weighs it down more and more and more, lifting the weight up into the air. So for that first stretch, you don't see any change. The scale stays exactly the same. But there is a tipping point where all of a sudden it tips over and you start seeing results. And that's the image that we should have in mind when it comes to habit changes. Don't expect to see the results for a while, but then when they come, they're going to be significant. But you have to stay focused on the idea of frequency. And that action should be the simplest form of any possible action. I remember one piece of advice I heard, and I think I may have shared it in another video, but someone gave the example that if you want a habit of working out at the gym, Don't make your habit working out at the gym. Make your habit driving there and sitting in the parking lot. And as long as you're able to do that, that's a win. And so maybe it's eating healthier. Maybe your smallest action is something along the lines of eating one serving of vegetables or something like that. But find the easiest possible thing to achieve and then make that your focus. As long as you're in action mode, you'll be succeeding. One other tip in terms of action, and that's make sure that you shape your environment to encourage that action. So, for example, get rid of the bad stuff. If you have a habit, and this is something that I did, if you have a habit of checking your phone while you should be working at your desk, I used to do that because my phone would sit on the charger on my desk. Well, if that becomes a bad habit, it starts to impede my ability to work, change the environment. And so I put the charging cable inside a drawer. And so now I put the phone inside a drawer. Adding just a little bit of friction makes it a little bit harder to implement that bad habit. On the flip side, let's say I want to drink more water every day. Well, all I do is fill up a water bottle and put it at my desk. And that's it. That's the habit, is to fill up a water bottle and put it at my desk. I don't hold myself accountable for drinking it, but the simple fact that the environment is shaped to encourage it means that I'm going to end up drinking that water. The second thing I learned is that consistency matters more than time. And another way of looking at this might be that systems matter more than goals. See, goals set direction, but systems make progress. And one thing that the author said in the book that really stuck with me was, we do not rise to our goals, we fall to our systems. And our systems are the thing that make something happen consistently on a day-to-day basis. An example of a goal is like a 30-day challenge, right? A 30-day diet or a 30-day workout plan or a 30-day reading plan or, your New Year's resolution. Those are goals. And they might orient us in a certain way, but they often don't stick. And we've all had goals that we set and we put a time limit like 60 days or 90 days, thinking that, well, if I can just tough it out for 60 days, it'll become permanent. And then that's not the case. Not always, but we often end up reverting back to the old way of doing things. And so having a system that encourages consistency, that matters a lot more, because the other thing is that the cost of failure is much lower. The daily benchmark is more sustainable. So if we take that example of the bottle of water, if my system, my daily habit is to have a bottle of water at my desk every day, there's not much cost of failure associated with that. Like if I miss a day or I miss 2 days, I didn't lose a whole lot. If my atomic habit is something like 1,000 steps around the neighborhood, a 5-minute walk around the neighborhood, and I miss it 1 or 2 days, it's not going to really affect me all that much. There's a low cost of failure. But if I'm doing a 30-day challenge where I have to eat a very strict diet or follow a very strict workout plan, or I have to read, 100 pages a day because I'm going to read one book every week, if that's the goal and I miss 1 day or I miss 2 days, the cost of failure becomes very high and almost insurmountable. And that's what makes people lose motivation, because now that I've already missed 2 days, I'm too far gone to come back. It's going to be too difficult to get back on track. So a system combined with an easy to do action, it lets us show up even when we don't feel like it. And it also mitigates against the temptation to revert back to old habits, because again, it's so easy to achieve that even if we miss a couple of days, we get right back on and keep going. And eventually, over time, that action and that consistency will win out. The third thing that I learned from the book Atomic Habits, intrinsic motivation matters a lot more than outcome-based motivation. Outcome-based motivation is very difficult to sustain. And if the results don't start to come quickly, we lose interest. So for example, an outcome-based motivation might be, I want to read 100 books this year. And so in month 1, if I only read 4 books, I'm already short of my goal. And then now, if I don't make it up in February, and in February I stay at the same pace, I'm going to be further and further and further behind. The motivation is going to dissipate very quickly. But if I go with an intrinsic motivation, meaning something along the lines of my identity, I'm someone who likes to read. I'm someone that's healthy. I'm someone that exercises. That intrinsic motivation and that identity is a much stronger motivator than that end goal that's outcome based. And the way to build that intrinsic motivation, ironically enough, or interestingly enough, is with an atomic habit. Because when you have a small action, it becomes easier to tell yourself that story, to reinforce that identity that I am the type of person who does X. And so eating a side of broccoli every night with dinner with my pizza and my chicken nuggets might not make me lose weight, but it reinforces my identity as someone that's trying to become healthier. And the more that I reinforce that self-identity, the more willpower and motivation that I build up to take more and more action over time and develop the habits that I need to then reach some of those broader goals that I have. So be consistent with your small action, have a system in place to achieve it, and shape your identity around it by doing it frequently. And so that's 3 things I learned from the book Atomic Habits. You can get a link to the book in the show notes below. If you enjoyed the video, please share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and share it with a friend. Otherwise, see you in the next video. Thanks.